Welcome everyone to Conversations on Social Issues. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. I am Kimberly. I work in the Seattle Central Library and I'm one of the reference assistants. So if you're new, I want to tell you who runs this and why we do it and how you can get involved if you want to. So this event, as I mentioned, is hosted by the Seattle Central Library. And we see this as an extension of the library's charge to promote freedom of information and the open exchange of ideas. So though none of us are going to agree on every single thing that's written in the library's books or in our databases or in the periodicals that we have, we want to provide access to that information so that the community we serve can learn from different viewpoints. This same philosophy is expressed by providing space for this series on social issues. All points of view are welcome, and everyone should feel free to express their own opinion. At the same time, I want to ask everyone to be respectful of what others have to say. If you want to learn more about the topic today, we have some great resources in the libraries, books, magazines, articles, journals, etc. That you may want to take a look at. And before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone has one of these little yellow slips where you can find the library's survey about this series. Grab one before you leave if you don't have one now, so you can tell us what you like, what you'd like to see in the future, so we can keep this interesting and engaging for you. So a quick note, next week we'll have Christine Moore, a faculty member in the English department, who will be facilitating a discussion entitled Beauty as Social Currency. So if you would like to organize a conversation around a particular topic for next year, let me know. But today, please join me in welcoming history faculty Craig Schwartz as he leads a discussion entitled Will China Rule the World?
Thanks, Kimberly. I think it's really important before we get started to recognize this person right here, Kelly McHenry, who she had this great idea to do this a couple years ago, and it started out with kind of, initial steps forward, and it's turned into really a good program here. And to see this kind of turnout, I think, is indicative of her good work, as well as Kimberly and so on. So let's just have a quick hand for Kelly.
So many of you have shown up, and that I have the support of these great faculty and students and administrators who have done presentations for our series. And I hope you'll consider doing it next year. If you're sitting next to an empty seat, could you raise your hand? There are people in the back that can't find a place to sit. And there are 4 seats up here.
Thanks. As we get started here, we obviously have a very provocative topic, and it's a very important one for the world. I assume, not everyone, but most people sitting in this room were born after the Cold War ended. As the Cold War ended around 1991, 1992, in that period, thinkers in the United States were full of pride and hubris. We just won this Cold War, and the future really looks great for, I'll use the term, the American empire, right? In other words, the Soviet Union has been defeated. China, well, they're starting to develop that. No worry. The future looks very bright for America. That the United States would basically be the hegemon, in other words, the most influential player in world politics for years, decades to come. And in fact, that influential book at the time was called The End of History, which basically said, class conflict is all over now, and we don't have to worry about the Soviet Union or their kinds of things. It's going to be an American century. Well, here we are, just a little more than 20 years later, and we got news in the press last week that it seems that sometime in 2014, the year that we're in right now, that China will have the largest economy in the world. And that's really pretty amazing because I remember 20 years ago, people started to predict that China would eventually have the largest economy in the world, but they said it was going to be in 2050 or 2060 or 2070. But here we are right now, and I think that's the major reason we have to look at this. What does it mean that China, from now on forward, probably for more than 100 years, if not beyond that, will be the largest economy in the world? And as capital that gets accumulated in the country, particularly the United States, the reason the United States was so powerful and influential was not necessarily because of their ideas, although those are important. It was because capitalists in this country had major influence on world developments, right? Well, it looks like we're going to see a similar kind of situation emerging in China. So let's go on and talk about this. So China is a country right now, it's about roughly the same size as the United States. It has 1,350,000,000 people, okay? That's about 1,040,000,000 more than the US, all right? So it's about roughly 4 times larger than the United States. And even though it's getting to be the largest economy in the world, that doesn't mean Chinese are richer, right? Because they have 4 times as many people to divide up that pie, and that pie in China is not being divided very equally. So let's not assume that everybody in China is getting better off, because in fact there's probably at least 600 or 700 million people in China right now that are probably worse off than they were 20 years ago. Okay? But a lot of people in China are also doing a whole lot better. Okay? So I'm going to try to answer this question, and I'll just tell you right now so we can stick with the theme all the way through. I think the answer to the question is no. Okay? And as my presentation evolves, we'll point out why it's no. Okay. So China is a unified ancient realm. It's united by a common history, a common language, and a culture. And even though there's a communist party in power, it in many ways is very similar to Confucian emperors, all right? And what traditional Chinese emperors wanted to do, as well as the Communist Party, is to create harmony between the heaven and earth, right? In other words, the earth should be a peaceful, harmonious place that is in congruence with the heavens, okay? Very interesting concept, because what people are talking about is a collective society where there's a collective kind of identity, right? Unlike American culture, where we're individualists, in China, people are more often way more willing to accept what their government do, unless the government does anything wrong. And China has a long history of people saying, guess what, Emperor? Time to get lost, okay? You blew it, we're starving, okay? And then it's okay to overthrow that emperor and get a new one, okay? So they got a very, very interesting kind of tradition. But the last point here on this screen is very important. Han Chinese are the largest ethnic group in the world. 92% of the people in the People's Republic of China are Han Chinese, over 95% in Taiwan, for example, okay? So what does that mean? It means people who are Han Chinese have common characteristics. They all share the same, language, they eat similar kinds of food, they dress similarly, and so on and so forth, right? And they support their family traditions. They're into supporting their ancestors and very strong. It's very strong characteristics of that culture, okay? Largest ethnic group in the world, okay? So that's 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people. Okay, and we're going to take you back a little bit in history. You see this little guy here? That's Columbus's ship. That's the Santa Maria. Okay, it was about 75 feet long, right? And those of you that went to American schools, you learned about Nina, Pinta, and the Santa Maria, right? And Columbus's great voyage in 1492. Well, about 70 years earlier, under the Ming Dynasty decided, we're going to go explore the world, right? And so they built a fleet, right? And this fleet was pretty amazing, because its major ships were what we call treasure ships. those ships were 410 feet long, right? That's about 100 foot longer than a vessel called a destroyer in the U.S. Navy today, okay, right? This ship, those sails, made out of silk, right? The boat was double hulled. I don't know if that means anything to you. What it means is that on both sides of the plank, it had wood, which meant it was very, very difficult to sink those ships, okay? So starting very early in the 14th century, the emperor sent out Admiral Zheng Ho, right, on this expedition. And you know what they sent? You know what they left with initially? They left with 300 ships and 25,000 Marines, right? And technologically unbelievable. Okay. And here's another view this is a view, an artist's rendition, because there are no surviving drawings or anything of these ships, okay? Because what happened is in the 1430s, the Ming Emperor decided to discontinue the program. They took all the ships apart, and they decided, guess what? We have everything we need, okay? Even though they checked out all these places, okay? This is what they did on these explorations. They went all the way to Japan. They went all the way over to the east coast of Africa. They explored India. They went to the Persian Gulf. They traded. They set up embassies and so on and so forth. And when they got done with it, they decided that China had more internal problems to deal with, and that the world didn't really have much to offer. What was the internal problem in China? They were always being invaded from the north. Okay, so they always had to deal with nomadic warriors and so on and so forth. And why am I showing you this? To give you some sense of the continuity in Chinese culture. They've been around for a very, very long time. Okay, First Chinese Empire began 221 before the Common Era. If you prefer the Christian terminology, that means 221 BC. Okay. In the years since then, maybe the 2,300 years since then, China has had a unified empire for 1,800 of those 2,300 years, right? And what's amazing about the emergence of the Chinese language and Han culture, some of you may not know this, but everybody in China that speaks Chinese and reads Chinese, they can all read Chinese regardless of what their dialect is, okay? So a person that speaks Cantonese or speaks Mandarin, which is the main language, they can read Chinese script, right? Which is amazing. It's an amazing source of unification. It's sort of like if we only the language we had here in the West was Latin, right? But we all read it and understood it, but we pronounced it as Italian or as French or as Romanian and so on, okay? But that's a major unifying impact. And here's some of the things that they accomplished technologically between 200 BC and in the next 1,000 years, a little bit more than 1,000 years. They developed a stern post rudder, which helped them figure out how to steer ships, okay? They invented the paper making process, right? Despite what we hear about Gutenberg in the 15th century, they, in fact, were the first people, along with the Koreans. We'll give the Koreans some credit here for developing movable type. And they developed the magnetic compass. You don't go anywhere in a sailing vessel without a magnetic compass. They developed gunpowder, various armaments, cannons, bombs, you name it. And very early on, they figured out how to do silk production and porcelain, which were two of the biggest items in international trade for 1,000 years. And the other thing they did is they developed a canal system. They figured out how to hook up the Yangtze River and the Yellow River deltas through an elaborate canal system 1,200 years ago. Okay, so they figured out the technology more so than any other cultures in the world at that point. Okay, now I want to just jump forward again. Okay, so the Ming Dynasty ends those ships. Right? Too bad they didn't go another 30 or 40 years with it, because they would have run into Vasco da Gama, right, or Columbus on one of those trips and probably packed him up as a rowboat and put on their back deck. But they didn't. But I want to just talk about switch to the modern period here. In 1800, 300 years after Columbus, 300 years after what Adam Smith said was the greatest event in world history, China still had the largest economy in the world, okay? It produced 32% of the GDP in the entire planet, and not far behind was India, by the way, okay? Right? But just 100 years later, they had an economy that was very weak, and they were down to 7% of world production in a 100-year period, right? China, essentially by 1900, had become the third world, right? And it had a humiliated, devastated people. So what happened? Why did that? Did it just fall out of the sky? Imperialism, okay? That's our basic answer here, okay? What do I mean by that? Imperialism is when one country uses its political, economic, and cultural clout to control or influence the land, labor, and resources of the world, okay? And England, at this point, was the largest imperialist power in the world. There were others, France, for example, okay, the United States emerges later on. But what happens is, I'll give you just a little illustration, this is pretty interesting. In 1792, 1793, which in our terminology in this country was the George Washington administration, the British sent a delegation, a huge delegation, to China, right? 700 people, they wanted to set up trade and do this and so on and so forth. And the Chinese emperor said, get lost, not interested, okay? Right? Well, guess what? England comes back 40 years later, and the world has changed. Why has it changed? Because of the Industrial Revolution. England was the first country in the world to industrialize, okay? What did that mean? That meant they built railroads, right? They figured out how to use textile production, hook it up to steam engines, and billions of other things. And one of the things they figured out was by the 1830s, they figured out how to make steam-powered vessels that were completely made out of iron, all right? So what happens, how does this fit in? Well, here's what's going on. The Opium Wars. Here's what the Opium Wars did. Anybody ever heard of the Opium Wars before? Yeah. Okay. So essentially what's going on is that England wants to get all the stuff that China has to offer. It has to pay them in silver, right? And they were buying so much stuff from China that it was draining their silver supply, right? So they had to figure out some way to reverse the trade, okay? They had to figure out what product it is that we could have, right? That would, so we wouldn't have to spend all of our silver. We'd maybe get some more money coming back our way. And the way to do that was opium, okay? Right? And opium, if anybody here knows anything about opiates, they're highly, highly addictive, okay? We don't know for sure, but by the time we get to the 1830s, there may have been as many as 40 million people in China addicted to opium, particularly along the coastal cities, and of those 40 million, half of them were heavy users, okay? Right? And so how big of an impact was that? Major impact. It devastated parts of the merchant class. It devastated educated people a lot. It wasn't people in the countryside so much, it was people along the shore. It was devastating. So the Chinese emperor said, no more opium, we're not going to do this anymore, right? And they even had a ceremony where they took 20,000 chests of opium. That's a lot, right? And dumped it into the river, right? Of course, they were very respectful and said prayers for all the wild creatures in the river and stuff. But the British insisted, right? Well, guess what? That's where the British were getting the opium from. They're getting it from India, and they were getting it from farmers that had been devastated by the deindustrialization of India. India used to have the largest textile industry in the world, but the British came in and wiped it out. Okay? So what did farmers do? They found another crop that worked, and that crop was opium, right? Well, when all this conflict happened, the British came in, okay? And they began this opium war. What's it for? To try to sell as much opium as possible to the Chinese people. And they brought in the Nemesis. The Nemesis was their ship, right? It was an amazing ship. It was about 130 feet long. Did not have one stick of wood on it. It was armed with modern weapons, right? 150 horsepower engine, and they just devastated the Chinese fleet. And they did it. And there was a second episode of it. But basically, from that point forward, for the rest of the century, China, not entirely, because China was so unified, it was difficult, but European powers were able to take over key ports of China over the next 100 years, okay? And it devastated the Chinese economy, okay? And and also, there's one other thing we have to throw in here that's not really necessarily tied into imperialism, just to be fair, okay? And that is, China reached their biological limits by the early 19th century. What do I mean by that? Is that by the early 19th century, Chinese were not able to expand their frontier because all of the land for farming had been used up, okay? And there wasn't enough food anymore, okay? So you started to see all kinds of serious problems in China, okay? Including some major rebellions in the middle and the latter part of the 19th century that killed millions of people. So China was basically in disarray, falling apart, being subjected to European rule by the end of the 19th century. And when we get into the 20th century, the process still goes on, and eventually what happens, I don't have all of the material here, but by 1911, the dynasty, the last Manchu dynasty, comes to an end, and they try to create a republic, but then we get World War I, we get World War II, and starting in the 1920s, there's a major conflict between the communists, led by Mao Zedong, right, and nationalist Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, right? And what's that about? That's about who's going to create a new China? Who's going to create a new government? Is it going to be led by a pro-Western Kuomintang nationalist, or is it going to be led by Mao Zedong, who had good ties with the Soviet Union? So that goes on and on and on. We get World War II, and what happens after World War II is the Chinese struggle against foreign invasion is successfully led by the communists, who defeat their enemies internally, the Kuomintang, and they create the People's Republic of China in 1949. And we can all have our different opinions about what happened in China under the communists, about the Cultural Revolution, and about the Great Leap Forward, and all those kinds of things. But overall, the way I see it, I see the Communist Party not as a working class party of the Chinese people. I see it as the party of the Chinese capitalist administered state that essentially was a nationalist formation that all of its weaknesses and all of its problems, the thing that it did is it reclaimed China for the Chinese people. That is a very, very important thing, okay? And why is this so important? Because I think a lot of people in the West, including the United States, don't understand how much misery the 19th century caused in the Chinese people, and the psyche that lasted for a very, very long time, okay? So, Chairman Mao dies in 1976, and by the time we get into the 1980s, the Communist Party is led by Deng Xiaoping, and one of the things that he does is he starts to create this state-administered capitalist society, using the power of the national bank system, foreign investment, etc., to start to sell goods on the world market. And by the 1990s, China really was the workshop of the world, okay? Right? I can't, when I go into my classes around here anymore and I ask people if they ever worked in a factory, because I have when I was a young guy in college and stuff, nobody works in factories anymore. They've all been moved to China or you know, other places, okay? And here we go. This is last week's headline. China could overtake the U.S. as the world's #1 economy this year, okay? Now, this is a little bit misleading because they did some fancy statistics and they used something called purchasing power parity, which is how much money you can buy with a yuan in China and how much combine the U.S. with it to do comparison. But nonetheless, the numbers still aren't going to come out favorable to China probably for another year and a half for total gross domestic product in the country, right? So China is clearly on the move. China has reclaimed their place in the world. And that's not a very good shot there, but you know, China has got an active space program now. China has landed a vehicle on the moon, right? It is building a space station now. China has plans to go to Mars in 15 years. Did you know that? That's what their plan is. So they're on the roll, right? And as you know, it takes really, really great technology to figure out how to get to outer space and back, okay? There's another, there's the astronauts, okay? Now, let me just take a look at this chart just for a little bit here. I don't know if you can read those figures back there, but these are figures about the size of national economies in two time periods, 2025, this is projections towards the future, and 2050. These statistics came from Goldman Sachs. Have you heard of Goldman Sachs? This is one of the banks that helped devastate this country a few years ago, right? But these are statistics from 2007, and what's interesting is that their projection for 2025, right, this was just 7 years ago, showed that in 2025 the U.S. was still the #1 economy, with China almost catching up. Well, hey, those guys were wrong, okay? Because these statistics are a little bit off, but still they're relatively meaningful, okay? So look at that. United States, #1, China 2, Japan 3, and you know we heard on the news the other day too? Guess who's been pushed into 4th place now? Japan, who's in 3rd place. India. Okay? So the world is changing very rapidly, but let's look at the ones on the bottom. Those are really more interesting if you can see them. #1 shows that China in 2050 is almost double the size of the economy of the United States, right? You can imagine the amount of political and economic strength that will give them if they can accumulate that much capital, right? They can do anything with that. They can send people to space if they had to in a war. You know how many people China can put in the army if they needed to? 300 million people. You know? I don't think we're going to fight those kind of wars anymore, but it just gives you some sense of what's going on. But so #2, and India looks like it's tied with the United States for #3, and Brazil is 4, Mexico is 5, Russia is 6, Indonesia is 7, and Japan is dropped back to 8th place, right? Japan's got some problems, not with their technology and their capital structure, but Japan doesn't have any people. You know, Japan is facing depopulation, right? So they have some serious problems, and on and on. And then some of the other lists are a lot of these countries are Asian. So we're especially moving into an Asian world. Okay? About more than 60% of all capital investment these days, 60% of all savings that people put in their bank accounts, right, or corporations put in their bank accounts, now come from Asian countries, right? Europe and the U.S. no longer the dominant force in the world. Okay. But China's going to have a lot of problems they have, right? Polluted air and water. You can pick up a newspaper at least once a week and show somebody walking around in some industrial center in China with a dust mask on, right? Because it is awful, right? So they've got polluted air and water, but you know, maybe they're going to do something about that. Well, they are. Who's making the cheapest and best solar panels in the world right now? China, right? Okay. Who's experimenting with massive numbers of windows? China, right? Who's built the best train system in the world lately? China, right? All these things are happening. So they're attempting to solve these problems, but I just think that, you know, pollution a lot of times comes with early capitalist development. The same thing is happening in Brazil. I remember as a kid living in Green Bay, Wisconsin, when we were this big world growing economy, and when we came out of school, at the end of the day, we would sometimes have to get handkerchiefs out of our pockets because we started crying immediately because the paper mills were just dumping just all kinds of stuff and smokestacks everywhere, coal. Okay, 1/5 of China's farmland is polluted, right? You have to give us pause about what it means to be an organic farmer, right? And here's another one that's going to be a real problem for China. Okay? And what China's been doing since these economic reforms started in the 1980s is they've been trying to figure out how to get people from the Chinese countryside, mostly Chinese peasants, to move to the cities to work for wages. Well, you know what? Chinese people have a very, very strong history of resistance, right? More so than anybody in the world. So, for example, we don't know, but last year there were at least 80,000 strikes in China, right? Okay? So, workers in China, hey, they remember Mao Zedong, right? His favorite slogan was, "It's right to rebel," right? And so workers did that, and that's going to be a serious problem. This one here is about shoe factory workers that are striking over benefits, right? And it's not just a small company, it's like 20,000 workers or something like this, and this is happening. So China's going to have to solve that problem. They're going to have to solve the pollution problem. I don't have a slide up here, but they have massive water pollution, okay? Conflict with their neighbors. And this is where you're going to see a lot of activity in the next few years, so get out your newspapers or get on the internet, whatever source you use, and here's the deal. Look at this here. Okay. So we've got Vietnam, Laos, China, Taiwan, Philippines, Brunei, and Japan. Right up here, but the whole series of islands in here, okay? There's the Paracel Islands, okay? And other islands to the north. This is a very big stretch of the South China Sea, right? Long distance. And all of these countries, Vietnam, China, Japan, the Philippines, are all arguing all over these islands. And some of these islands are about 3 times as big as this room. Okay? What are they arguing about? Oil, and more oil. Okay? Now, and what's really interesting, I think, in terms of the way China perceives this, is they're having this struggle with Japan right now over these islands up here, right? And Japan says, you know what? Those islands belong to us according to the treaty of 1895, right? And 1895 was during the period of Chinese devastation, right? When they signed treaties that they felt they didn't really have to have. You know what the Chinese say? The Chinese say, you know what? Those are our islands because the Japanese emperor kowtowed to us in the 13th century. Okay? Those are the kind of arguments you'll run into, right? Because what China has been is saying here, we've been a civilization, we're different than just about any place in the world, and we're here to stay. And when they take these kind of arguments into the modern nation-state context, you're going to have all kinds of problems, right? And so, what about the United States? Let's just throw them in there. Okay? As we speak, President Obama has engaged on a policy called the pivot towards Asia. Okay? Oh, what's the pivot mean? Well, it means he's sick of the Middle East, right? Because the Middle East, hey, lost the war in Iraq, lost the war in Afghanistan, right? Very unpopular, so let's do something different to preserve the U.S. empire, right? Remember, the U.S. is a slowly but important fading world power with the largest military in the world. And the U.S., I think, is probably more willing to use the military now, right? Because they don't have the economic resources that they used to. You know, the Iraq War cost over $1 trillion, right? Okay, and so on. And so they're gonna argue over this stuff for a long time. And Obama comes in with this pivot. You know what his pivot is? His pivot is to try to figure out how to prevent China from becoming the major power for a long time in Asia. That's what Obama's policy is. And you know who he's trying to make big friends with these days? I think it's hilarious, the Vietnamese, right? A country that less than 40 years ago defeated the largest military power on earth. The Vietnamese are now American buddies, right? And 2 weeks ago, Obama signed a new base with, So, anyway, I'm going to go on and make a couple more comments. So, there's going to be a lot of conflict in that zone, right? And the U.S. is going to try to make allies there. It's going to try, and they'll pass it off in the press as trying to share responsibility for the South China Sea with our friends in Asia. That's how they'll pitch it, okay? Right? Okay? But what he's really after is control over the oil, just like, right? So this is going to be a major test, and I suspect that China is not going to back down from any confrontation on this with anybody. Right? And it'll be a real interesting thing to watch. Okay? And then, so the future. Are we going to have cooperation? Right? Manage conflict? Are we going to have war? I can't imagine war. I can't imagine anybody wanting war anymore, right? And we know how devastating it is, how much it costs. But I also know that the track record for countries like the United States and Germany and Japan and China itself is not very good when it comes to war. And I just hope that over the years we can address some of these issues and problems. Hopefully the struggle over the South China Sea can be reconciled peacefully. Maybe they'll decide to have a cooperative and share it all, right? No? Okay. And then lastly, here's what I think. I think China will not and does not wish to rule the world, but it will emerge as the dominant power in Asia for the foreseeable future, united by its history, culture, and the Han Chinese, okay? In other words, here's a way to kind of sum this up. Remember I put that slide up there about the Chinese economy in 1800, and then it goes the tanks, right, because of imperialism? I think the Chinese have been taking a nap for about 200 years, right? It's imposed by others, right? And they're awake, and that culture is stronger than ever, and it is going to be, there's just no way to deny it. It's going to be the dominant force in Asia for a very long time to come, but with lots of problems and potential issues along the way. So, I can take questions now. Still have about 12 minutes, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I'm just kind of thinking about possibilities for conflict. I know that China has kind of subscribed to this policy of non-intervention in foreign countries, right?
Right.
But it seems to me that they're engaging in kind of this soft power influence, economic influence, especially in Africa and other places throughout the world, in terms of injecting a lot of foreign direct investment and things like that. So how do you see the competition between the U.S. and China in that sphere, not necessarily militarily, but in that soft power sphere playing out?
That's really a good question, okay? I mean, I think it's real clear that what's going on the South China Sea is of historic interest to China, right? Just like maybe Mexico would be to us, or something happened like, or like the Ukraine is to the Russians. But China is now the largest investor in the world in Latin America, America's quote backyard, right? It's also one of the largest investors in Africa. China is on the move. And so the question becomes, what are they after mostly? China's mostly after raw materials to feed their industrial machine. And so I think that they're going to, and I can't predict it, but you got it right on the head. It's going to be an enormous political issue about what's going to happen in Latin America. And they'll get really touchy because the U.S. will say, well, you know, Latin America's been our backyard forever, right? Well, people in Latin America don't think that, but that's what America is. So that's going to be very touchy. And the stuff in Africa is going to be real interesting too. And did you guys know that that a new alliance has been formed excuse me, not a new alliance, but a new military. Oh, okay. A new military structure has been formed by the United States and Africa, and the United States can only find one country in the whole African continent that will let them have a base there, and that's Djibouti, right? Which is a little teeny country out of the Red Sea. Right? The United States has got serious problems, and lots of money is going in, and it's mostly over resources. Yeah. So who else had a hand up there? Yeah.
Do you know that China just bring one ship that goes from Vietnam to the Vietnam East Sea, the Vietnam East Sea, and then so that is Vietnam's East Sea part, and start to find the oil in that sea just 2 days ago. So can you make that? What will happen after that?
They just found oil.
Yeah.
They just found oil in this part.
Can you repeat the question?
China just bring one big ship that costs $1 billion to the East Vietnam Sea. I mentioned that is Vietnam Sea, and start finding the oil in there. So can you imagine that will happen after that China's action?
So did you say the East China Sea?
No, it's East Vietnam Sea.
So China just brought a ship that cost her $1 billion to the East Vietnam Sea.
Yeah. That's on the Google map is called South China Sea. The Vietnamese call it East Vietnam Sea.
Okay, so it's called the South China Sea, but the Vietnamese call it the Vietnamese Sea.
Yeah. So what will happen?
What do you think will
That's
happen?
China's action.
Well, you know, the Vietnamese and the Chinese fought a war in 1978, okay? And the Vietnamese have not had the best of relations with the Chinese over the last 1,000 years. And so I think it's going to be a very difficult, situation. Very difficult. Yeah. Well, let's take one back here. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you explain the United States view for the islands and neighbors in China?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, can you repeat that one more time?
Can you explain the United States view for the islands near China?
Can you explain the United States view on the islands near China?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. The United States, here's a way to look at it. The United States is an imperialist power, and the U.S. uses its foreign policy, its cultural influence, to do everything it can to make sure that the business environment, that resources, et cetera, are available to the United States, Japan, and its allies in Europe, right? So when it looks at what's going on in the South China Sea, it's not thinking like, hey, we need to have all that oil right now. But what we need to do is we need to have a political environment that's favorable to the West, okay? And that means if we need the Vietnamese, right, or if we need the Filipinos or whatever, we will use them and cut some kind of alliance to make sure that the U.S. keeps the economic structure open to Western control and penetration. Okay? Yeah.
I want to ask you, like, what do you think about the Chinese currency and the United States currency? Because as I know, like, in 2008, the exchange rate is 126, and now it raised up to like 126.3.
So I'm not a real strong expert. She wants to know about the changing rate of the yuan, right? Chinese currency. And China and the United States have been arguing about this for 15 or more years. And the United States wants the currency to go in higher value because Chinese, it'll be more expensive for them to ship goods here, et cetera, right? And that's still going on right now. And China doesn't necessarily want to have their currency evaluated too high because then it'll be harder to export products. Okay? So, this gentleman back here.
America has a pretty long tradition of going places and then setting up governments that are at least supposed to be like ours. Do you think China may be interested in doing this in the near future in, you know, places that are not like in East Asia, like in Africa or South America possibly?
That China would directly go?
Not necessarily militarily, but like trying to like using culture and like their economic power to kind of force a preferential, similar like state as they have.
I think China would probably do some of those kinds of things, but I can't imagine China wanting to have any kind of government that was strongly associated with them as a kind of a lackey state of China. I mean, China's position so far with Latin America and Africa is, what? We'll loan you money, we'll buy your goods, we'll do this, we'll do that. We're not going to interfere with your internal affairs. Under the assumption that you're not going to mess with ours and you're not going to go to the UN and accuse us of human rights violations or anything like that because we are the Chinese, we're not a Western country, we're not a country that prides itself in individualism, we're into China as a whole. So I think it'll be interesting to watch, but I doubt if China would directly try to, you know, have a kind of a new colony or something like that. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't try to manipulate the political situation to make sure that they get the most favorable kind of trade deals. And then Chinese are everywhere. They're buying up everything in Australia. You know, like one of the things that we're facing right now is the Keystone Pipeline and you know, the trains and all that kind of stuff. Well, one of the major issues, one of the major things that's coming up right now is that if the Keystone Pipeline is canceled, right, what you're going to do is the Canadians are just going to build big trains and they're going to take it all to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and put it on ships and send it to China there, right? Same with the coal. So we got a lot of different things going on. Yeah, go ahead.
So a lot of how China's kind of beefing up the GDP is by just like building stuff like cities and giant projects. And that seems kind of like a possible bubble that would want to burst. If it does, do you think that would have a big impact on China's economy and the global economy as a whole?
You know, as China becomes increasingly capitalist, and this is a good question, they have to obey the laws of capitalism, right? And the laws of capitalism essentially mean at some point, even as a state-directed society, you're going to lose control over your investment, you're going to lose control over your banks, and that kind of bubble is exactly the kind of thing that can bring down the Chinese economy. And when it does, it's going to bring down the whole world economy. You know, there used to be a saying we heard in the 50s and 60s all the time is that, you know, when the United States gets a cold, the world gets the flu, right? When the United States gets the flu, the rest of the world is a disaster, okay? And the same kinds of things will happen. And some of that stuff you see in China now, it's unbelievable, right? Like cities built for 50,000 people and no one's living there, and so on and so forth. And they have all this kind of capital, and they're investing in projects kind of on a hope and a prayer. But from their perspective, I guess, since they have the Communist Party, they probably have more ability to control capitalism than most societies do because, for example, just on a little level, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, China decided to get rid of plastic bags. Is that right? Can you imagine Obama getting on TV and saying, no more plastic bags after tomorrow? No? Boy, Fox News and the right wing, they'd be all over us for violating their freedoms and they'd be getting their guns out and going after us. Right? But in China, you know, even though there's a shady business deal behind it all, China says no more plastic bags, no more plastic bags, and most people in China see that as a good thing, right? But you know, it's a really good question. But you're right, it could bring the world economy down. Anything else? Yeah.
Speaking of the Communist Party, because of the concentration of power in the Communist Party, do you foresee any hope of democratic reform in the People's Republic of China?
You know, I think the hope for democratic reform is your mind, when I sometimes make that argument, it's kind of a pro-Western argument, okay? It's wrapped up in your view of the way this country evolved and stuff. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people in China that would like a democratic reform, right? But overall, I don't think so. I don't see China right now evolving into a Western-style democracy. I think we'll still see the Chinese state controlled by the Communist Party or some successor entity that's basically going to administer a good society in China. So we have one really short question. Yeah, go ahead. Back.
Yeah, so can you show your predictions about the U.S. when China and they're making conflicts with the others? So what side the U.S. going to be, or are they just step apart and observe?
Can you repeat that?
I mean, like, show your predictions about the future. Like, when China making conflicts with the others, like Philippines, Vietnamese, yeah. So what the U.S. going to do, or are they just observe?
So the question is, can you make your predictions about what the U.S. is going to do if China has conflicts with other countries like the Philippines? Do you think that the U.S. will step in, or will they just observe?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I can handle that really quickly. Here's the deal. The United States spends all military spending in the world, almost 50% of it is the United States, right? Okay? China is developing its military very rapidly, but its military is mostly developed to protect Chinese interests in Asia, right? Okay? So I think that if the U.S. and China have conflict in regions outside of Asia, that China will be more willing to cooperate and work something out. If there's anything close to Asia that bears on U.S. interests, the U.S. isn't going to have very much leverage, right? Because if China, let's say for example, if China gets its military spending up to the point of the U.S., and it still mostly uses it to defend their interest in Asia, there's no way ever that the U.S. could do that, because the U.S. has to be able to, from its perspective, use its military for the whole world, right? So what that means is that the U.S., to be able to prevail all over the world with China, it's going to have to quadruple the size of its military, which has and will have devastating consequences for this country. You think your tuition rates are high now, right? Just wait till we start spending 8 or 10% of our GDP on the military. So in closing, you know what? One of the very best things that all of us can do is to follow the news and participate in these discussions, participate in these struggles. If there's a solution, if there's a situation that needs your input, that needs a little bit of peace brought to light, then we have to do that, because I'm not very confident these leading capitalist powers, whether they're China or Obama or Bush for that matter, can develop a peaceful world. So I see a world with a lot of conflict ahead, but also great possibilities, but it's up to us as citizens and participants to help make the changes. Anyway, thanks very much.
Please take a few moments to fill out the survey that you can find the link